Hey, what's up? This is Troy with Comics Code Atrocity, and today I want to talk to you about the X-Men Cinematic Universe timeline. If you're like me, when you watched the Deadpool 3 trailer, you got the feeling, hey, I want to rewatch and marathon all of those 13 Fox Studio X-Men movies. But if you're also like me, you thought, well, what order should I watch them in? There's a lot of period pieces, there's a lot of time travel, so I went and looked up some of the lists online, and I have to tell you, I pretty much disagreed with all of them for one reason or another. So I came up with my own list. This is the Comics Code Atrocity official X-Men Fox Studio timeline. You can watch all 13 movies in this order, and it works pretty perfectly. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about where I think Deadpool 3 fits in. Alright, let's get at it. First, I'm going to go over the original timeline. This was the correct timeline before any time travel had happened. We start with the obvious one, X-Men First Class. Chronologically, it takes place in 1962. And this is just a great origin story of Professor X, Magneto. How the X-Men are formed is everything you need, and no amount of time travel has ever messed with this movie. Then we have X-Men Origins Wolverine. Chronologically takes place in 1979. It is the story of Wolverine, how he gets involved with Weapon X, how he gets the adamantium claws, and more importantly, how he loses his memory, which leads into his place in the overall story. Then we get into the original X-Men trilogy. First we have X-Men, chronologically takes place in the year 2000. X-Men 2 takes place chronologically in the year 2003. And then X-Men Last Stand, chronologically takes place in the year 2006. That's easy. That is the original timeline. Makes sense, right? Then we get into The Wolverine, chronologically takes place in the year 2013. It is a great epilogue as to Wolverine coming to terms with the events of X-Men Last Stand, and more specifically, there is an after credits scene that explains what happens to Magneto and Professor X. And now we get to the end of the original timeline. X-Men Days of Future Past chronologically takes place in 2023, 10 years after the events of The Wolverine. In the movie, Logan goes to the past, 50 years into the past, 1973, and does a series of things that changes the timeline. This is what creates the alternate path. That means that X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men, X2, X-Men Last Stand, and the Wolverine are no longer chronologically valid moving forward from 1973. There will be a series of changes, and I will discuss them in each of the movies. But I do want to call out something specifically. I think what confuses a lot of people is the end of Days of Future Past, where Logan goes back to the future, to a version of 2023 that shows several actors from the original X-Men trilogy, but to me, this scene solidifies that happy ending of 2023 is in a new timeline. There's even a line where Logan admits that his version of history is going to be a little bit different, and Professor X makes a joke that we're going to have to go through these things. To me, everything that follows after this point up to 2023 is Professor X telling Logan what happens between the events of 1973 and 2023 in this new Days of Future Past timeline. In this new timeline, the Days of Future Past timeline, I do want to establish that X-Men First Class took place in 1962. It is still 100% canon. Nothing was changed from that movie. The first movie in the new timeline is X-Men Apocalypse. Chronologically, it takes place in 1983. There are several changes right off the bat. Mutants are known worldwide because of Magneto, whereas in the original timeline, it wasn't until the year 2000 that mutants were known outside of being like an urban legend. So because of that, people were worshipping the first ever mutant, Apocalypse, and brought him into modern day, which would not have happened in the original timeline. There are also a number of other things that indicate that this is a new timeline someone like Mystique reconnecting with Xavier, whereas in the original timeline, she just continued to be a villain forever. Now she gets to be a hero again. We see Cyclops and Jean Grey free Wolverine from the Weapon X program. What we see is significantly different than the X-Men Origins Wolverine movie, because in Days of Future Past, he is caught in a different way and did not volunteer into Stryker's program like we saw in the original timeline. And there's something I want to mention when we get to Logan, but I do want to just call it, this is an entirely different Wolverine story in this new timeline as well. But the biggest significant difference is the fact that 23 years earlier than X-Men Last Stand, Jean Grey has to activate her Phoenix Force, leading into X-Men Dark Phoenix. Chronologically takes place in 1992. As a younger woman, Jean Grey has to deal with the Phoenix Force herself. By the end of this movie, she basically rides off into the sunset, implying that she died. But if you've read comics, you know that she will be able to resurrect herself down the road. She was not killed by Wolverine like she was in Last Stand. Now, next up is a bit of a tricky part. There is nothing shown in this new Days of Future timeline from 1992 to 2016 chronologically. There are some things that we know for a fact are different. There are some things we assume will be the same. But this 24-year gap has no movies, and we just need to accept that that's what happens in this timeline. Moving on. Deadpool chronologically takes place in 2016. Yes, Deadpool has, let's call it, metaverse observational powers, but this movie Deadpool takes place in the new timeline because of the events that were changed to Wolverine's origin. Wade Wilson now is not part of the Weapon X program, and we got to see a new origin for Deadpool. Additionally, in this movie, we do get a different version of Colossus, and I believe that is also because in this new timeline, he was not an American that we saw in X2 and X-Men Last Stand. Next is New Mutants. Chronologically takes place in the year 2020. Then that's what leads us into the end of X-Men Days of Future Past that takes place chronologically in 2023. The conversation between Logan and Professor X has now ended, and those 50 years have been accounted. And this leads us into Logan. Chronologically takes place in 2029, 6 years after the ending of Days of Future Past. There are a number of things in this movie that solidify to me that this takes place in the Days of Future Past timeline and is not a sequel to The Wolverine. First off, we have a conversation with X-23 about these comic books that represent the lives that the X-Men lived. In the Days of Future Past timeline, all the way back in the 90s, is public knowledge that the X-Men exist and are superheroes. It makes more sense that there would be very colorful comic books with all these different stories than it would in the original timeline with the black leather suits where they're still in hiding. There is a smaller Easter egg, which is Logan's dot tats, which in the original X-Men Wolverine Origins, he specifically has those dot tats removed and he gets new ones made that say Wolverine that we see throughout the original timeline in multiple movies. But in this new timeline, we have a different version of him being drafted into the Weapon X program. So the dot tats never changed, and the dot tats seen in Logan that say Logan match up with this new timeline. Finally, I just personally think that it makes a lot more sense that Wolverine and Professor X are a lot more bonded. Yes, of course, they would still be bonded as characters in the original timeline, but I think that these two characters, be the only two people that know an alternate timeline did exist, bonded them a lot more, which made sense for their friendship in the movie Logan. Which leads us into the third timeline change. And I'm going to call this the Deadpool Timeline. Now you might ask yourself, but Troy, you said the first Deadpool is in the Days of Future Past timeline. I'm going to need you to give me a little bit of faith here. 40 years into the future, after Logan, we see Cable's future. It looks very similar to a Days of Future Past, which I think thematically fits with how X-Men comics roll. No matter how many times they try to change their fate, it always ends in a bleak future for mutants. In Deadpool 2, chronologically, Cable is in the year 2068. He travels 50 years into the past, changing the timeline once again. Very similar to how Logan traveled 50 years into the past the first time. When Cable travels to 2018, it creates a new timeline that erases New Mutants, the end of Days of Future Past, and Logan. In this new timeline, everything from the Days of Future Past in 1973, Apocalypse, Dark Phoenix, that 24-year gap, and the first Deadpool are still canon. It's just everything after 2018 that has changed, which leads us into Deadpool 3, which takes place in 2024. And here's where I think it's important that 24-year gap and the comic books shown in Logan matter. From what we have seen, that Deadpool 3 is going to be pulling from a universe that has colorful costumed characters, much like the comic books in Logan. So I think Deadpool 3 will take place in 2024, but will have some level of time travel and go over that 24-year gap from Dark Phoenix to the first Deadpool movie. And that is my complete list of the 14 X-Men Fox franchise movies. Now, if you disagree, leave comments, let me know. I actually want to know if this works or not. Also, if you think I'm way off the base on where Deadpool 3 fits into this timeline, I know there's been a lot of different rumors, let me know. Leave a comment, I'd love to talk about it. I'd love to get some other people's ideas. Alright, happy watching. I'll see you guys in July watching Deadpool 3 with the rest of you.